Hello, welcome to Module 4, Lesson 2 of our CASP Plus course. This lesson in Governance, Risk, and Compliance will cover the following topics about managing and mitigating vendor risks, covering vendor lock-in, merger acquisition risk, meeting the client requirements, and ongoing vendor assessment tools. Explaining the importance of managing and mitigating vendor risk. An enterprise will need to assess risk whenever significant business changes are undertaken. There are many activities that will require an enterprise risk to be evaluated. A large enterprise may be engaged in outsourcing services to third-party vendors, often cloud-based. Maybe the enterprise will consider a merger or acquisition with a company operating within a different regulated industry. There are many examples of attacks that have been launched, like exploiting supply chains, often relying on a lack of visibility on the part of the enterprise. It is important to assess all risks that may be present when we work with third parties. When performing vendor assessments, we need to ensure they meet the expected levels of compliance required by the enterprise. Now, to ensure a vendor meets the expectations of the business, we may audit the vendor or use third-party assessments. Now, the following topics should be considered during an assessment. First is we need to talk about vendor lock-in. It is important to assess all available options when bringing in external providers or technology solutions. CSPs or cloud service providers would be a good example of potential lock-in, where the provider can impose strict financial penalties if the customer decides to switch CSP before the end of a specific contracted period. Now, if the service is not adequate and cannot be improved due to a lack of defined service level agreements, then the customer may have to accept an inferior service. So technology may also be a contributor to lock-in when bleeding-edge technologies may be adopted. Later, the customer realizes the solution locks them into an incompatible database format. This could result in a solution that would be very difficult to migrate to another platform. Vendor lockout could also be considered, and this is when the vendor makes it difficult to work with third parties as their service may be incompatible. Now let's talk about merger and acquisition risk. So when an enterprise is considering a merger or acquisition, it is important to consider all risks that may transpire. Merging with a company in another geographical region may introduce practical problems such as language barriers, cultural differences, and different working practices. Now, when considering mergers, it is important to assess the risks of co-joining networks, as there may be different regulatory requirements. And when moving into a new industry or business sector, regulatory compliance or legal requirements should be considered. Data may need to be segmented and classified to ensure correct data handling is observed. And when considering the mergers, it is also imperative to plan for correct handling and access of business data. Meeting client requirements. The enterprise may have very strict requirements, right, when engaging with third-party vendors. The enterprise may have strict legal requirements that must be addressed. Major changes that may impact the customers should be agreed upon in advance using an effective change management process. Now, if there are any significant changes in staffing levels that may impact the business, then there should be a clear communication channel for this event. When the vendor supplies staff directly to the business, then it is important that any staff changes are communicated to the business. Staff changes will require an onboarding and offboarding process. The client may also have very strict requirements concerning technology and the security configuration of information systems. Support availability. It is important to agree upon levels of service, right? And these agreements must be realistic and will be negotiated between both parties. Clear reporting metrics and agreed response times must be set. There should be a legally binding document generated, and this is known as our SLA, or Service Level Agreement. Next is a geographical consideration. So data sovereignty is an important consideration for many organizations, including government agencies, critical infrastructure, and regulated industries. There is a legal requirement in some areas of operation that may require strict adherence to the storage and transmission of certain data types. It is important that the vendor service is compatible with these requirements. Supply chain visibility. So when working with third-party vendors, it is important to identify all potential risks that may be within the supply chain. Regulatory authorities have strict rules concerning data processors, such as in GDPR, right, or General Data Protection Regulation, which is a very good example of this. A data processor is an entity that would handle customer records or other sensitive data on behalf of the data controller. A data controller can expose an enterprise to additional risks, and this is often referred to as a downstream liability. Next is incident reporting. If the vendor suffers an incident, such as a data breach, then we must be informed in a timely manner. As the business will be the data controller, then the business is liable for subsequent actions. A large company, such as a bank, may work with a vendor to offer additional services to its customers. If the vendor processes the customer records data, then any breach that happened, right, whilst they process the data will impact the bank. Next is source code escrows. So here, when external development teams are engaged to write applications for the business, it is important to address risks associated with the potential failure of that external supplier. If time and money are invested in the development of tools and systems, it is imperative that the source code can be retrieved by the customer. In normal circumstances, source code would remain the property of the external developer. The customer may have paid for the development of functioning code only. Future bug fixes and security patches will be difficult without future-proofing the availability of the original uncompiled source code. A third party would hold a copy of their source code, only releasing it to the customer in the event of the developers going out of business. Now let's talk about ongoing vendor assessment tools. It is important for third-party vendors to adhere to their intended customers' legal and regulatory requirements when providing services to government organizations or commercial clients. The discussion of typical third-party assessment example are as follows. First is the U.S. government FedRAMP program. So before being authorized to operate, cloud service providers offering their services to the U.S. government must be accredited by the Federal Risk and Authorization Management, or FedRAMP, before they will be provided with an authority to operate, or ATO. So to find more information, you can go to www.fedramp.gov. Next is a Cloud Security Alliance. Organizations can be audited to ensure they meet the CSA Cloud Control Matrix in order to demonstrate compliance to commercial customers. This cloud computing cybersecurity control framework includes 197 measured controls. Vendors can offer their services through the Cloud Security Alliance if they meet these requirements. So the following links, right, will provide you additional details about the Cloud Security Alliance, or CSA. Next is the International Organization for Standardization, or what we call as ISO. So the ISO has defined a number of security standards. The following standards, right, would be of particular interest to vendors seeking to reassure clients for their adherence to security, right, which is this one. So this standard covers every important control that needs to be used when hosting information systems to guarantee secure operations. This standard does not grant accreditation or certification to any organization and is only intended as guidance. It enables a company to adhere to regulations, resulting in the adoption of the ISO 27001 compliance. So this specific URL will take you to for more information about ISO 27001, sorry. Next is technical testing. It is important that the vendor offers the required technology to satisfy the customer needs. The supplier might be a subcontractor in a manufacturing setting where quality assurance or QA is important and necessitates frequent on-site inspections. Next is network segmentation. Network segregation, right, is frequently needed for businesses in order to comply with regulatory bodies. As a result, the vendor must adhere to these specifications. Like, for example, the networks for industrial control systems or ICS, SCADA, and OT or operational technology should not be connected to the same network as the user in the business world. Air gaps may be necessary for some vectors or some sector segmentation, while VLAN should suffice in other cases. Next is transmission control. Every effort must be made to maintain confidentiality when data must be sent between the customer and the vendor. Where the vendor will act on the client's behalf and share data with third parties, confidentiality is also important. The vendor might be in charge of maintaining and monitoring the SCADA network for the client. In this situation, they should use an IPsec tunnel and take the deployment of jump servers into considerations. Shared credentials. Now, since individual accounts are necessary for an effective audit trail, the use of shared credentials should be avoided. A user can gain full access to a system using the default credentials, such as the administrator account on Windows or the root account on Linux. It is common practice to grant users access by including them in a role group so that the accurate audit trail can be created. All right, that's the last part of the lesson. Here we spoke about vendor lock-in, merger acquisition risk, meeting client requirements, and the ongoing vendor assessment tools. Again, thank you very much for watching the video.